The 6 a.m. shift started the way it always did, fluorescent lights buzzing like trapped insects, the smell of antiseptic sharp enough to sting the back of her throat, and Katie Rodriguez moving through Oak Creek Memorial with a kind of precision that made it look easy. Her badge clipped to the pocket of her scrubs. Her hair in a tight bun. Her hand steady as she checked the medication dispensary, counted the vials, logged each one with the meticulous care of someone who understood that details kept people alive. The ICU was almost empty at this hour. Just the machines breathing for patients who couldn't breathe for themselves, and Katie, who had walked these corridors for 15 years and never once let anyone see the weight she carried inside. She moved from room 341 to 342 to 343, adjusting 4 drips with a practiced touch, reading vital signs off monitors with the speed of someone fluent in a language most people never learned. O2 saturation. Heart rate. Core temperature. Pain is data, she thought, the way she always did, because that's what the senior chief petty officer had been trained to believe, that pain meant something, that the body told stories if you knew how to read it. The faded unit patch was sewn inside her jacket lining, hidden beneath her scrubs, the kind of patch that only 3 people in the hospital would recognize, and she'd made damn sure none of them knew she was here. Room 347 had been prepped overnight. New sheets. Fresh saline hanging. A chart clipped to the door that read Major Chris Rodriguez, training accident, Class 2 trauma, admitted 11:51 p.m. Katie's hand hesitated on the door handle for exactly 1 second, the kind of hesitation that looked like nothing, that felt like everything. She pushed the door open. He was asleep, or pretending to be. Broad shoulders against the hospital bed. Dark hair. The kind of face that had seen things and decided not to talk about them. Katie had seen that face before, in her son's video calls, in the way her boy stood at attention when Rodriguez walked past, in the way soldiers talked about someone they'd follow into a burning building. Major Chris Rodriguez. The man who had promised to bring her son home from Tikrit, who had written her a letter 6 months ago that said he'd done everything he could, who had probably never mentioned to anyone that she existed at all. She checked his monitor without looking at his face. Heart rate elevated but steady. O2 saturation holding at 94. The morphine drip was set to standard dosage, 2 milligrams every 4 hours with patient-controlled anesthesia if needed. His left leg was immobilized, the femur fractured in 3 places according to his chart. Clean break. Surgical repair already done. He'd be walking again in 6 months if he followed protocol. Morning, Major, Katie said, her voice level as still water. I'm going to check your dressing. Rodriguez, he said, not moving. First name Chris. You don't have to call me Major. She was already unwrapping the surgical site, careful not to disturb the sutures, reading the wound the way she'd read 10,000 wounds before, pink at the edges, no discharge, no sign of infection. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory taking over, the precision of someone who had done field surgery in places where the definition of field meant a helicopter with no doors flying through hostile territory. How's the pain? She asked. Manageable. He watched her work. You move like you've done this before. Like you've done a lot of things before. Katie said nothing. She taped the dressing, logged the time on his chart, and was already moving toward the morphine drip when she noticed something that made her stop. The foresight was red, slightly swollen, and the rate on the pump didn't match what was written in the chart. Dr. Hargrove's handwriting, she'd seen it 100 times, the confident scrawl of someone who never second-guessed himself. Morphine for milligrams every 4 hours instead of 2 milligrams. And then, in smaller letters, a notation she'd never seen before, add to Level 2 supplies billing. Level 2. That was code for premium billing codes, the ones that bumped the cost up by $800 per day per medication administered. Katie's jaw tightened. She said nothing. She documented what she saw, the swelling, the dosage, the billing notation, in her own notes, careful to keep her handwriting clinical and objective. Per protocol, she thought. Always per protocol. Always leave a paper trail. Always make sure someone else could see what you saw if they bothered to look. "Your foresight is irritated," she said to Rodriguez. "I'm going to change it out, get you fresh access. Might sting a little. I can handle it." She found a new 18-gauge needle in the supply cart, prepped his other arm with antiseptic that smelled like iodine and hospitals, and inserted the line with a single smooth motion. No trembling. No hesitation. Just the thing done right, which was the only way she did things. Rodriguez watched her the whole time, and she could feel his eyes, the look of a soldier trying to figure out what he was looking at. "You're good at that," he said. 15 years of practice, Katie replied, and she moved on to the next room before he could ask any more questions. Dr. Hargrove arrived at 7:03 a.m., which was unusual. He typically didn't appear until mid-morning, sweeping through the hospital in his tailored suits like he owned the place and was doing the patients a favor by breathing the same air. This morning he went straight to room 347, his expensive watch catching the fluorescent light, his posture the kind of confident that comes from knowing there's no one in the room who can challenge you. Katie was in the hallway when she saw him arrive. She kept walking. She had her routine, and Dr. Hargrove had his, and they existed in the same building but different universes, and that was exactly how it needed to be. But she could see him through the open door. Could see him checking Rodriguez's chart. Could see him writing something on the medication order, his pen moving fast, his expression satisfied in a way that made her stomach tight. He was about to go. "Dr. Hargrove," she said from the doorway. Not a question. Just a name. Just a statement of fact. She'd been trained to report concerns, trained to speak up when something didn't add up, trained by a system that told her that safety matters more than hierarchy. "I noticed the morphine dosage on Major Rodriguez is higher than standard protocol for his injury classification." He turned slowly. The kind of turn that made it clear he was giving her his attention the way someone gives attention to a fly that lands on their newspaper, a minor irritation, easily swatted away. "Yes," he said, and his voice was smooth as oil and twice as slippery. "Major Rodriguez is military personnel. He has higher pain tolerance. Standard civilian dosages often prove inadequate. The foresight is showing signs of irritation from the current access point. Higher dosage concentrations can accelerate that." "Are you a doctor, Ms. Rodriguez?" No. She was not. But she was someone who had stood in surgical tents with shells landing close enough that the concussion knocked your footing out from under you. She was someone who had pushed epinephrine into the hearts of dying men with her own hands. She was someone who had saved lives because she understood that medicine was a science, not a show, and shortcuts killed people. "I'm flagging a concern per protocol, doctor," she said, and her voice was exactly the right amount of professional. Exactly the right amount of deferential. Exactly the right amount of nothing. The medication order and the billing code don't align with treatment history. "Thank you for your concern," Dr. Hargrove said, and the way he said it made it clear that her concern was being noted and filed in the bin where his opinions of nurses' opinions belonged, which was to say, nowhere. He turned back to the chart. "That will be all, Ms. Rodriguez. I'm confident in my prescribing decisions." She stood there for exactly 1 second longer than necessary, long enough for him to know she'd heard him, then she left. The touch under her jacket was still there, the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, the thing she'd never shown anyone because showing it would mean explaining it, and explaining it would mean ending the careful life she'd built. 15 years of being invisible. 15 years of being just a nurse. 15 years of holding her breath. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the sound she heard from Rodriguez's room as she walked away, the soft beep of the 4-pump adjusting to the new dosage Hargrove had set, each beep a small promise that she'd documented the problem and done everything right and that it didn't matter at all, because the doctor had already decided that his authority was worth more than her expertise, and the system would side with him every single time. The worst part was knowing that in a hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina, there was a Green Beret who didn't know he was being poisoned by someone wearing a white coat and carrying a prescription pad, and the only person who'd noticed was a woman who couldn't blow the whistle without revealing exactly who she used to be. Morning rounds at Oak Creek Memorial moved like clockwork at 6:56 a.m., and Dr. Hargrove glided through the corridors with the assured stride of a man who'd never been questioned twice. Katie pushed the med cart beside him, her eyes on the chart for room 347, the numbers still burning in her memory, dosages that didn't align with standard protocols, billing codes inflated by exactly 40%, a pattern that screamed deliberate markup rather than oversight. She documented everything. Per protocol. In triplicate. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining felt heavier than usual against her ribs as she walked. "Doctor, the medication order for Major Rodriguez," Katie said quietly, keeping her voice level as they approached the patient's room. "The dosage pattern doesn't match his injury profile. The billing codes are also showing." Dr. Hargrove stopped mid-stride. The hallway seemed to compress around them. He turned to face Katie with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of smile that could cut glass. The patient's family sat inside room 347, visible through the open door, and Hargrove's voice carried like he was performing on a stage designed just for moments like this. "Nurse Rodriguez," he said, each syllable a small blade. "When you complete medical school, you may question my orders. Until then, perform the duties you're actually qualified for." He gestured vaguely at the chart in her hands. "I understand civilian nursing can be less rigorous than what we expect here. Much less rigorous." The family watched. Two residents trailing behind them exchanged glances. A passing orderly slowed her pace, tuning in. Katie took one measured breath. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. She met Hargrove's eyes directly, not with defiance, but with the flat composure of someone who'd stared down worse across a continent that still lived in her nightmares. "I documented my concerns per protocol, doctor," she said evenly, each word deliberate and clear. She paused, long enough for the family to hear the professionalism in her tone, then added, "They're in your inbox." A single tear escaped down her cheek. Not from fear. Not from humiliation. But she let it fall anyway, because sometimes the most dangerous thing a woman could do in a hospital was appear vulnerable, and Hargrove's contempt deepened when he saw it. He interpreted tears as weakness. He had no idea that tears were a weapon she could deploy with surgical precision. She wiped the moisture away with the back of her hand, maintained eye contact for 3 more seconds, then returned to the med cart without another word. Hargrove moved on to the next room, but his work for the morning wasn't finished. At lunch, Katie sat alone in the break room with a container of leftover grilled chicken and steamed broccoli, the kind of methodical, tasteless fuel she'd been eating since Tikrit. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with the steady buzz of 1,000 frustrated conversations absorbed by the acoustical tile. She'd been there for 90 seconds when the room's gravity shifted. A nurse from pediatrics looked up from her phone. "Oh, I forgot, I have to check on something." Another from orthopedics gathered her things. Bathroom break. 2 residents who'd been reviewing lab results suddenly stood in unison, exchanging a glance that meant nothing good. "Conference call," one of them muttered, already heading for the door. Within 30 seconds, the break room was empty except for Katie and the sound of the refrigerator compressor cycling on and off. The silence was so thick it pressed against her ears like cabin pressure changing at altitude. She could hear her own breathing. She could hear the tick of the wall clock above the sink. She could hear the absence of human conversation, engineered and deliberate, a collective decision to make her invisible in plain sight. This was Hargrove's second move, and it was efficient. By 2:14 p.m., Katie found her name on the public disciplinary board outside the nurse's station. Not in some private HR office where these things belonged, but right there in the corridor where every staff member, every visitor, every family member shuffling past could read it. Rodriguez, K. Written warning, failure to maintain professional boundaries. Questioning physician judgment. Remedial training required. It was fabricated. Entirely. She knew this because she'd accidentally seen the billing records 2 weeks ago when filing the major's initial intake charts, just a glimpse, just enough to notice the supplier kickback invoices, the inflated quantities, the pattern of unnecessary upgrades. She'd closed the file immediately. She'd reported nothing to anyone except her own documentation in the system. Yet here was official hospital policy treating her like a liability. Hargrove walked past at 2:33 p.m., his timing too perfect to be coincidental. His voice carried down the hallway with the kind of studied casualness that meant he wanted witnesses. "Our little protocol warrior," he said to a cluster of residents, his laugh a practice thing that mimicked genuine warmth. "So dedicated to the rulebook. I admire the effort, even if the execution falls a bit short of what we need here at Oak Creek." The resident smiled nervously. Nobody defended Katie. Nobody said a word. She felt the walls tightening, the institutional machinery grinding into motion around her. This was Stage 3 escalation, no longer just social humiliation, but strategic isolation. He was cutting her off from peers, establishing doubt about her judgment, building a narrative. He was weaponizing the hospital's own systems against her, and the worst part was knowing she couldn't fight back without revealing the very thing she'd spent 15 years trying to bury. That evening, after shift change, Katie checked on Major Rodriguez in room 347. The evening nurse had reported him resting comfortably, but Katie needed to verify the medication order herself. She'd told no one about the connection, that this man in the bed was the commanding officer who'd called her the day they'd brought her son's body home from Tikrit. That he'd promised to look after the kid. That he'd kept every promise except the one that mattered. The major was sleeping. The 4-pump beeped softly, delivering Hargrove's dosage into his bloodstream on schedule. His vital signs looked stable on the monitor, but Katie's instincts, the ones from her previous life, the ones she kept buried under scrubs and routine, registered something wrong about the pattern. The heart rate was slightly elevated. The respiration rhythm too shallow. She made a note to check on him hourly tonight instead of the standard 4-hour intervals. Something was off. Something about this whole situation was spiraling in a direction she couldn't control, and for the first time in months, Katie Rodriguez felt like the trained operative she'd once been, completely aware that a threat was moving into position, and completely unable to warn anyone about it without revealing classified pieces of herself that the Navy had ordered erased from existence. Outside, the night pressed against the hospital windows like something alive and waiting. At 2:17 a.m., Katie made her routine rounds past room 347, and the door was ajar, wrong for this hour, against protocol, and her nervous system registered it before her conscious mind caught up. She pushed inside quietly, expecting to find the night nurse adjusting monitors or checking drains. Instead, she found a man in a ski mask standing over Major Rodriguez's bed, tactical knife glinting under the fluorescent lights, the major still deeply asleep from the sedation in Hargrove's medication order. "Where are the files?" the man hissed at the sleeping patient. Everything that came next moved like muscle memory unspooling. Katie stepped between them without hesitation, her hands raised, her voice steady and authoritative in a way that made the intruder's head snap toward her. "Security is 30 seconds away," she said, the lie coming smooth as breathing. "Leave now." The man lunged. The knife moved like a slender tongue tasting the air, and Katie's body translated the geometry of his attack into simple mathematics: trajectory, entry point, the exact angle of his arm as it descended. She couldn't step back. Major Rodriguez was behind her, vulnerable and unconscious. She could only step forward into the strike. The blade found her left side just below her ribs, penetrating through muscle and subcutaneous tissue with resistance like pushing through wet cloth. Real steel. Real pain blooming hot and white, spreading like wildfire beneath her skin. Blood spilled warm across her scrubs, soaking the fabric in seconds, the smell of it iron-sharp and immediate. She executed a controlled fall exactly as she'd been trained, angling her body on the way down, her elbow targeting the wall-mounted panic button with precision. Her back hit the linoleum hard enough to knock the air from her lungs, but the button depressed with a satisfying click, and somewhere in the hospital, an alarm began to scream. The attacker hesitated. 2 seconds. 3. Then he bolted for the door and vanished into the corridor. Katie pressed her hand against her side, forcing pressure onto the wound even as her vision tunneled. "Stay conscious. Assess." The major was awake now, gasping, his eyes wild with pain and confusion. His hand clutched at his chest. His neck veins were distended. His breathing came shallow and desperate. She recognized the signs immediately, the same signs she'd learned to read in a forward operating base in Tikrit, where shrapnel wounds didn't always kill you right away. Sometimes they waited. Sometimes they were patient. "Breathe, Major," she said through gritted teeth, each word costing her focus. "You're safe. Your heart's trying to tell you something, and I'm going to listen." Security arrived 30 seconds later. Hospital staff crowded the doorway. Someone was shouting for a trauma surgeon. Someone else was calling for an ambulance. But Katie Rodriguez was already reaching for the emergency cart with hands that knew exactly what to do, her combat medic training surfacing through 15 years of forced civilian normalcy, because Major Chris Rodriguez was developing cardiac tamponade and she had maybe 3 minutes before his heart stopped completely, and the only person who could save him was the woman he didn't know used to be a senior chief petty officer, decorated and classified and officially dead. The fluorescent lights above room 347 hummed their steady fluorescent hum, the kind of sound that belonged to the sterile hours between midnight and dawn when hospitals belong to the ghosts and the dying. Katie had been checking the Major's vitals every 30 minutes, his oxygen sat steady at 98%, his heart rate holding at 62, when she heard the window creak. Not a small sound. The unmistakable shift of glass against a lock that hadn't been secured because nobody locked windows on the 3rd floor of a hospital in Raleigh. At 2:17 a.m., the man came through in one fluid motion, boots hitting the floor silent as a predator crossing water. Ski mask. Black gloves. A knife that caught the hallway light like a surgeon's scalpel catching chrome. Katie's neural pathways registered all of it in the time it took to blink. Combat stance, trained movement, not robbery. The knife said it wasn't robbery. "Where are the files?" His voice came out flat, mechanical, the voice of someone reading from a script he'd rehearsed 100 times. Not looking at Katie. Looking directly at Major Rodriguez. Katie's hand moved to the call button. Slow. Deliberate. The man's head snapped toward her, and she watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. Did he see a threat or a nurse? The scrubs made the decision for him. "Don't," he said. She wasn't sure if he meant the button or the scream that was building in her chest. Major Rodriguez's eyes opened, just barely, confusion bleeding through the morphine haze. Trauma victims on narcotics moved through consciousness like they were swimming through honey. He wouldn't process fast enough. Wouldn't understand. Katie felt her feet shift, that automatic response her body remembered from 14 classified operations in Tikrit, from rooftops and interrogation rooms and the kind of decisions that got redacted from official reports. She stepped directly between the knife and the patient. "Step aside," the man said, but he was already moving, already committing, already bringing the blade in a tight arc aimed at the Major's chest. Katie felt the burn before she heard the sound. A hot line of pain that started at her ribs and radiated outward like spilled gasoline. The knife sank into her, 2 inches left of her umbilicus, and her muscle memory took over before her conscious mind caught up. She twisted into the motion instead of away from it. Let the blade slide between the ribs rather than puncture the organs. Small choice. Terrible choice. Only choice. The attacker cursed and yanked the knife free. Blood. So much blood. Katie had forgotten what her own blood looked like, how it felt spreading hot against her scrubs like someone had spilled an entire bag across her abdomen. She was falling backward, and she made it intentional, let her body go to the floor in a controlled descent that looked like collapse but was actually a calculation, her elbow hitting the nurse call button on the wall unit hard enough to trigger it, hard enough to send an alarm through the hospital's nervous system. Code blue, room 347, the overhead intercom crackled before the man could even process what had happened. He fled. Boots on tile, running. Gone. Katie pressed her hand against the wound and kept the pressure steady, the kind of pressure a person learned when they'd packed wounds in places where helicopters didn't fly and morphine was a luxury reserved for officers. The pain was information. Data. Every second her hand stayed pressed meant less blood loss. She measured it out in her head, 5 milliliters per heartbeat, maybe. 45 to 50 milliliters per minute. Not lethal if she kept pressure. Not yet. Major Rodriguez was more awake now, the chaos pulling him toward consciousness like a riptide. His hand moved toward his chest, his old injury, the shrapnel embedded near his sternum from an IED that had stopped killing him 15 years ago but never quite finished trying. His breathing was coming faster. Shallower. His hand was pressing against his chest like his heart was trying to escape through his ribs. "Hey," Katie said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, not the voice of the nurse, but the voice of the senior chief, the one who'd talked men down from ledges and through amputations and across mine-filled compounds at 0400 hours. "Look at me." His eyes found hers. "You're breathing too fast. Slow it down. In through your nose. For counts." "You're bleeding," his voice cracked. "Doesn't matter. Your heart is doing something wrong. Can you feel it?" He nodded, fear blooming across his face like spilled dye in water. "That's the shrapnel shifting. Probably pressing on the pericardium. Cardiac tamponade. You know what that means." "I'm dying." "No," Katie said, and she was already moving, still pressing on her own wound, still keeping the bleed controlled, her other hand reaching for the forestand and the emergency kit she could see from here without looking. "You're going to stay right there and breathe the way I tell you to breathe. You copy me?" The major nodded. Katie's hands moved on their own now, the way they had moved through 1,000 crisis scenes in 1,000 different theaters. The way they moved when the mind got out of the way and the muscle memory took over. She found a 16-gauge needle in the emergency kit, the kind meant for decompressing pneumothorax, but it would work here too. It had to work here. "In Tikrit," Katie said softly, keeping her voice steady, the way you keep your voice steady when you're teaching someone how to survive, there was a kid. Maybe 6 years old. IED took out the whole block. His heart was doing the same thing yours is doing. Filling up with blood it shouldn't have. You remember that?" The major was staring at her. "You remember?" "No," he whispered. "I do," Katie said. "I remember because I was the one who stopped it. Right here. Same procedure. And he lived. 12 years ago, and he probably still is living somewhere, and he's got kids of his own now probably, and his parents don't even know the name of the person who saved him." She palpated the major's chest, finding the landmarks with her fingers, the intercostal space between ribs 2 and 3, right of the sternum, the sweet spot where bone wouldn't interfere. Her hand was shaking. Not from fear. From the need to move faster. From the tremor of muscle memory pushing against the weight of civilian normalcy. "Why would you?" the major started. "Stop talking. Deep breath." The needle went in smooth. There was a specific sound that came when you punctured the pericardial sac, a tiny hiss like pressure releasing, and Katie heard it the same way she'd heard it in Tikrit, in that blackened room where a child had almost bled out into his own chest cavity. The major gasped, and his breathing came easier immediately. Color blooming back into his face. "Blood pressure," someone called. Katie hadn't even realized the code team had arrived. Dr. Hargrove was there, his hair disheveled, his tie loosened, his phone already in his hand like he was already calculating who to call. His eyes moved from the major to Katie, bloody and pressed against her own wound, the needle still in the major's chest with her hand steady on the plunger, and something changed in his expression. The concern evaporated. The calculation took over. "What have you done?" he said, not a question, an accusation. Katie didn't answer. She was listening to the major's breathing, to the soft whistle of air moving through the needle as fluid drained from his pericardium. Her work wasn't finished. "You performed a surgical procedure without authorization," Hargrove continued, his voice already modulating into the smooth tone of a man building a narrative. "You created a dangerous situation and practiced beyond your scope." "She saved my life," the major said, his voice coming stronger now. "There was a man. A knife. She." But Hargrove was already moving, already calling the nursing supervisor, his voice cutting through the code team's rhythm like he was orchestrating something they didn't understand yet. Katie pressed harder on her own wound and kept her eyes on the Major's monitor. The numbers were climbing. Oxygen sat 95. Heart rate steadying at 70. The numbers meant he was going to live. The numbers meant her work had worked. The numbers meant that in about 4 hours, she wouldn't have a job anymore, because you couldn't perform an advanced medical procedure as a registered nurse and then explain why you knew how to do it without revealing things that had been classified into oblivion 15 years ago. She met the Major's eyes, and for just a moment, she let him see it. Let him see that she knew what was coming. Let him see that she'd already made peace with it. Because some things were worth losing everything for. Some things were worth burning down a carefully constructed civilian identity to save. Some things were worth the cost. The blood continued to seep between her fingers, hot and slow, and she kept the pressure steady. The blood continued to seep between her fingers, hot and slow, and she kept the pressure steady. Her other hand was on the Major's chest, feeling the cardiac rhythm stabilize beneath her palm. Sinus rhythm. The monitor confirmed it, a steady beep, beep, beep that sounded like a second chance. That was 2:34 a.m. when Dr. Hargrove walked through the ICU doors with 2 hospital security officers flanking him like satellites orbiting a dying star. He took in the scene, Katie's scrub soaked with blood, the Major's chest bandaged with a makeshift occlusive dressing, the 16-gauge needle still visible where she'd placed it between his ribs, and his face transformed. Not with gratitude. Not with relief. With fury. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice cut through the monitors like a scalpel through silk. Katie didn't look up. She was watching the Major's O2 saturation climb, 88% now, steady at 91. The needle was working. The air was releasing from the pericardial sac, the pressure around his heart releasing with it. "Pericardiocentesis," she said flatly. His shrapnel shifted. Cardiac tamponade. He was exsanguinating into his pericardium. "You're a bedside nurse." Hargrove's voice dropped to the temperature of a walk-in freezer. "You don't perform surgical procedures. You don't practice beyond your scope. You certainly don't create dangerous situations that compromise patient safety." Katie finally looked at him. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were the color of storm water. He would have died in 4 minutes without decompression. "That's not your decision to make." Hargrove turned to security. "Escort her out. Now. Immediate suspension, pending investigation. She's created a liability nightmare, contaminated sterile field, performed unauthorized interventions, endangered the patient further." One of the security officers hesitated. He was looking at the Major, who was breathing more easily now, whose O2 sat was climbing toward 96%. The officer looked at Katie's face, not panicked, not defensive, just steady as a surgeon. He'd worked ICU security for 7 years. He knew the difference between a nurse in crisis and a nurse in control. "Sir, the patient's vitals are—" "I don't care about his vitals," Hargrove snapped. "What I care about is protocol. What I care about is ensuring that this hospital isn't sued into bankruptcy because some nurse decides she's a trauma surgeon." He turned back to Katie. "You're suspended as of right now. Don't come back on this unit. Don't come back in this hospital. We'll be contacting your references and the state nursing board regarding your conduct tonight." Katie's jaw clenched once. That was all. Just once. Then she released the pressure on her own wound. The cut was bleeding again now, a slow seep that stained her scrub jacket, and she stood, swaying slightly, before she caught herself. "His vital signs are stable," she said to no one in particular. "Pressure's holding. He needs continuous monitoring of the pericardium for fluid reaccumulation. Watch for pulsus paradoxus. If his blood pressure drops more than 10 millimeters on inspiration, you know what to do." Hargrove's face flushed the color of raw meat. "Get out." The moment she was gone, walking past security with her hand pressed to her ribs, Hargrove pulled his phone from his pocket. His fingers were trembling, but not from shock. From rage. From the cold calculation of a man whose control had been threatened and who knew exactly how to dismantle anyone who challenged him. He made the first call at 2:08 a.m. Board member's personal cell, a man named Sterling who owed Hargrove 3 favors after Hargrove had covered up a billing scandal at his private practice. "I need a narrative," Hargrove said quietly. "A nurse on my floor created a dangerous situation during a patient emergency. Contaminated field, unauthorized procedures, reckless endangerment. I need you to help me document it as protocol violation, not heroism. Can you do that?" Sterling's response was immediate: "Consider it done." The second call went to Patricia Mendez, head of HR, at 3:15 a.m. "I'm documenting her suspension in writing," Hargrove said. "I'll have a full disciplinary file ready by morning, an authorized scope of practice, patient endangerment, failure to follow protocol. I want her employment records pulled and reviewed for any prior incidents we can add to the termination paperwork. Backdate if necessary." "How far back?" Mendez asked, her voice carrying the practice neutrality of someone who'd been asked to do this before. 8 years, Hargrove said. "Find me something. A medication error, a complaint, anything." The third call, at 4:23 a.m., was to an outside investigator, a man named Garrett Hayes who specialized in hospital liability cases and who'd been quietly on Hargrove's payroll for 3 years. "I need you to rubber stamp a termination file," Hargrove said without preamble. "A nurse tonight performed unauthorized procedures on a post-surgical patient, contaminated the field, and created immediate danger. I need your report to confirm that this was reckless conduct that violated protocol, and that her suspension was entirely justified. I'll have the narrative ready for you by dawn." Hayes had already been paid $8,000 that month. He'd be paid another $15,000 for this. He didn't ask questions. "I'll have something for you by 8 a.m. By 6:41 a.m., Katie was sitting in a waiting area outside the hospital administrator's office, a woman named Dr. Colleen Chase, with a manila folder in front of her. Inside were fabricated incident reports dating back 8 years. A medication error from 2016 that had never happened. A patient complaint from 2019 that had been dismissed. A pattern of concerning judgment that had been carefully constructed out of nothing. Hargrove stood beside the administrator's desk, his face the picture of concerned professionalism. "I take this very seriously," he was saying. "The incident last night was the culmination of a pattern. This morning, after reviewing her file, I realized we've had concerns about her scope creep for years. Last night simply forced us to take action." Dr. Chase was reading through the folder, her expression growing more troubled with each page. She'd been at Oak Creek for 4 years. She didn't know Hargrove's methods yet. She didn't know how to read the subtle signs of manipulation, the backwards construction of a narrative designed to protect someone and destroy someone else simultaneously. "The investigator's preliminary report confirms protocol violations," Hargrove continued, sliding Hayes's 4-page document across the desk. Hayes had done good work, technical language, medical references, just enough specificity to sound authoritative while saying absolutely nothing that could be independently verified. "I believe termination is the appropriate action." Katie sat in the waiting area, her wound wrapped in a bandage that had begun to seep through again. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't slept. She had her hands folded in her lap, and her composure was a glacial thing, ancient and impenetrable. Across from her, a new nurse, Sarah something, kept glancing over with an expression that mixed pity and fear. "I'm sorry," Sarah said finally. "About last night. Everyone's saying you saved his life." Katie didn't respond. She was thinking about Tikrit. She was thinking about 14 operations she could never talk about, 37 lives she'd pulled out of hostile territory, and a navy that had ordered her to become invisible. She was thinking about her son, the real one, not the one she'd seen die on paper 8 years ago, and how she'd kept this job so carefully, so quietly, never letting the seams show. She was thinking that she'd been so close to being normal. 8 years of this, and nobody had known. Nobody had questioned. She'd been just a nurse, efficient and quiet, asking questions about medication codes because she'd been trained to notice corruption, to see the patterns that didn't fit. She'd never been supposed to notice. She'd never been supposed to care. She'd been supposed to disappear, period. But she'd cared about the major. And now they were taking the job anyway. At 11:38 a.m., Dr. Chase called her into the office. The conversation lasted for minutes. Katie listened to words like liability, scope of practice, patient safety, and immediate termination. She listened to Hargrove stand beside the administrator's desk, nodding gravely, his expression suggesting he'd fought for Katie but ultimately lost. She listened to her own voice, when they asked if she had anything to say, respond, no. At noon, she was standing at the exit of Oak Creek Memorial with a cardboard box pressed against her ribs. Inside was a cracked coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters. A dying succulent, a small jade plant she'd kept alive on her desk for 6 years, now withering because she'd forgotten to water it during the emergency. And a photograph in a wooden frame, the kind they give you from the official records, her son in his dress uniform. The notification card was tucked behind the frame, KIA, 2016, Tikrit Province. She didn't know he was alive. She didn't know that Major Chris Rodriguez had called from his hospital bed, his voice clear and steady, and said 2 words to whoever answered the secure line, "It's her." She didn't know that those 2 words had started a machine in motion, calls to commanders, calls to the Pentagon, calls to people who'd been waiting for her to break cover, to reveal herself, to prove she was worth the operation that had gotten her own son killed and brought her a fake burial notice instead. Rain was falling. November rain, the kind that cut through jacket fabric and soaked into bone. Patterson Avenue was slick and dark. Katie stood at the bus stop, the cardboard box getting wet, her breath fogging in the cold air. A bus pulled up. She didn't board. She just watched it leave, carrying people who had homes and identities and futures that belonged to them. She had none of those things. She never had. At 12:16 p.m., Hargrove was in his office, phone pressed to his ear again, speaking to the contact who handled the medical supply company money. "It's handled," he was saying. "The problem's been terminated." No record she ever questioned anything. Clean narrative. Nobody will be asking questions. He didn't know the FBI had been monitoring every call. He didn't know that the files the attacker wanted, the ones Katie had glimpsed, the ones that showed the kickback codes, had already been copied by federal agents 8 weeks ago. He didn't know that his conversations were being recorded, analyzed, and prepared as evidence for a conspiracy charge that would eventually carry a sentence of 12 to 18 years. He didn't know any of that because he'd never considered that someone might be watching him. Because people like Hargrove never think about consequences. They only think about power and how to keep it, and what they're willing to sacrifice to maintain the illusion of control. But that wasn't the worst part. The convoy of black SUVs rolled into Oak Creek Memorial's parking lot at precisely noon, the tires crunching against fresh asphalt like artillery fire in slow motion. 30 soldiers stepped out in perfect synchronization, dress uniforms crisp as new currency, boots hitting the pavement with the kind of unified rhythm that made hospital security reach for their radios and then immediately stand down. They moved through the ER doors like water finding its level, purposeful, unstoppable, impossible to redirect. The ICU hallway had never seen anything like it. Nurses stepped back into doorways. A doctor checking labs froze mid-stride. The lead soldier, Major Chris Rodriguez himself, his arms still carrying the slight stiffness of recent trauma, moved toward Katie's station with the other uniformed personnel flanking behind him like an honor guard. His eyes found hers across the fluorescent-lit space, and something in his face cracked open, the professional composure of a special forces officer giving way to something raw and necessary. He stopped 3 feet from where she stood, and the room held its breath the way only hospitals can, machines beeping their mechanical hymns into the suddenly unbearable silence. The young man in the Green Beret uniform stepped forward, and Katie's hands went still on her paperwork because she recognized his jaw, his eyes, the precise angle of his shoulders, features she'd memorized 14 years ago and committed to the sealed vault of memories she wasn't supposed to have. "Mom," he said, and his voice was her son's voice, matured and deepened by things she couldn't ask about, things classified beyond the reach of mothers and their questions. You don't have to hide anymore. The words hung in the hospital air like a defibrillator charge, suspended between past and present, between the dead and the impossibly, miraculously alive. Katie's breath caught, not a gasp, not a sound of surprise, but something deeper, something like a dam breaking in slow motion. Her son stepped closer, still in his dress uniform, still carrying the weight of 8 years of classified operations and a death notification that had been a lie. I'm alive, Mom. I came home. And I've been looking for you since the day they told me you were gone. Major Rodriguez extended a folder to the hospital administrator, who'd materialized with the pale, confused expression of someone about to lose control of the narrative. The folder was cream-colored, heavy with official seals, the kind of document that changes everything. Inside were medals listed like poetry: Bronze Star, Silver Star, another Silver Star, Purple Heart, Purple Heart again, Navy Cross. The administrator's face drained of color as she read the declassified summary. Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Marie Rodriguez. 14 classified operations. Tikrit Operations Group. 37 operatives extracted from hostile territory. Combat Medic Certification with Advanced Trauma Authorization. The administrator's hands trembled as she read further, and she looked at Katie with the expression of someone who'd just realized they'd been standing next to a legend wearing scrubs and an ID badge. The SEAL commander in dress whites, chest full of medals that made the administrators look like children playing pretend, stepped forward and addressed the gathered crowd with the kind of authority that only comes from surviving things that would kill ordinary people. This woman ran point on 14 classified operations in Tikrit, he said, his voice like a tank engine idling in an underground garage, powerful and measured and absolutely certain. She pulled 37 operatives out of hostile territory. She was declared KIA to protect an operation that your hospital's investor was trying to expose for profit. The rain outside had started without warning, hammering against the ICU windows with the rhythm of applause. The SEAL commander continued. She gave up her rank, her identity, her entire life to protect operational security. That sacrifice didn't end when the operation concluded. It followed her here. 10 minutes later, the FBI arrived with the certainty of an anvil dropping from a very great height. The lead agent, a woman with eyes like wet stone, placed a document on the administrator's desk with the precision of someone laying down an indictment. Dr. Hargrove had been selling patient information to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands for 3 years. $470,000 in kickbacks from a medical supply manufacturer whose equipment he'd ordered obsessively, equipment that generated commission payments routed through offshore accounts. But that wasn't the worst part. The agent's partner opened a second folder, and the administrator leaned in, her face losing what little color remained. The files the attacker had been searching for, the ones he'd stabbed Katie for, contained evidence of Dr. Hargrove's criminal negligence during the stabbing crisis. He'd altered her termination records to show she'd been fired before the attack, not after, to hide that his medication orders had left Major Rodriguez vulnerable to the cardiac tamponade that nearly killed him. You see, the lead agent said, her voice flat as a judge's gavel, when Nurse Rodriguez saved this man's life, she inadvertently proved that your doctor's negligence had created the conditions for the attack to be lethal. So he tried to bury her. He forged employment records. He created a false disciplinary narrative. That's obstruction of justice. The agent turned and nodded to her partner, who moved toward Dr. Hargrove's office with 3 uniformed officers. When they emerged, Hargrove was moving backward between them, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume, his face the color of old newspaper. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists with a sound like the world's smallest bell ringing. His lawyer would arrive within an hour, but the damage was already written into the permanent record. By 3 p.m., his contract was terminated. By 5 p.m., the state medical board suspended his license indefinitely. By evening, local news ran footage of his perp walk, Hargrove's face carefully angled away from cameras, which meant the images captured something worse, the slump of his shoulders, the reality of consequence catching him like a man who'd finally understood velocity too late. The nursing staff who'd avoided Katie in the break room now circled her like planets finding their orbit, crying apologies she didn't need to give, speaking over each other with the frantic energy of the guilty. Katie accepted their words with the grace of someone who'd already moved beyond needing validation from them. The administrator offered reinstatement with back pay, a formal apology, the restoration of her good name. Katie declined with 3 words. "I'm done hiding." She said it the way a door closes, final and without drama. She'd already interviewed at the Raleigh VA hospital across town, a place that understood invisible wounds, a place that trained medics who'd seen things that required more than a nursing degree to comprehend. Major Rodriguez visited her new office on a Tuesday morning, still moving carefully but alive because of her hands, because of her knowledge, because of a combat medic's training that hospital policy had tried to erase. "Your son never stopped talking about you," he said, standing in the doorway with his green beret perfectly angled. "Even when we thought we'd lost him. Especially then. He'd talk about watching you train medics at Camp Lejeune, how you never looked away from what was broken, how you fixed things other people gave up on. When I got orders to bring him home, that was the first thing I thought about. How would I tell you that he was alive? How would I make you understand that the woman you'd been carrying in your chest all those years could finally stop carrying a ghost?" Katie's son had stayed in Raleigh for 2 weeks, making up for 8 years of classified separation with dinners that lasted until midnight, stories that couldn't be told in the order. They happened because some of them were still classified, but enough truth came through to bind them back together. He'd been captured during an operation in Kandahar, held for months in a black site so classified that even his own mother's military contacts couldn't locate him. He'd been declared KIA to protect the ongoing operation, and that death notification had been delivered to Katie as final and absolute and beyond appeal. But prisoners were exchanged 6 months ago, and he'd come home. And he'd looked for her. But she'd been hiding in Raleigh under a false name, and finding a ghost is harder than finding a person. The 100 Green Berets had sent a framed photograph, all of them in formation outside Oak Creek Memorial, a banner across the front reading Senior Chief Rodriguez, one of us. It now hung in Katie's new office alongside a photo of her son, finally home, finally able to wear his uniform in the light instead of in classified darkness. 6 months after Dr. Hargrove watched the handcuffs close around his wrists, Katie pulled her car into a strip mall parking lot on a cold Saturday morning and saw him sitting at a folding table outside a discount insurance office. He'd lost 50 pounds. His face was gaunt, his eyes the color of someone who'd forgotten what sleep felt like. His expensive suit had been replaced with a clip-on tie and a blazer that looked like it came from a thrift store clearance bin. Supplemental policy brochures were stacked in front of him, and his smile, when he tried it on passers-by, looked like a scar. Federal conspiracy charges were pending trial. Prison was coming. His medical license was permanently revoked. His wife had left in month 2. Katie parked her car and walked over to the folding table. Hargrove saw her and flinched as if she were something that could hurt him, which was perhaps the most honest moment of their entire professional relationship. She placed a bottle of water on the table in front of him. "It's hot out here," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of calm that only comes from someone who'd already survived worse. He stared at the bottle, then at her, confusion and shame battling across his face like armies with nowhere else to fight. Katie turned to leave, then paused. "You saw someone you could break," she said, and her voice remained level, measured, absolutely devastating in its precision. "Someone you thought had no power. No voice. No one who'd fight for her. You were wrong about all 3. She walked back to her car, where her son waited in the passenger seat, both of them in civilian clothes now, no longer separated by classification or death or institutional lies. They drove to the VA hospital, where 20 new medics were waiting in the training room, needing someone who understood what it meant to carry invisible wounds, needing someone who could teach them that mercy doesn't require permission. That evening, standing in her office as the sun set over Raleigh in shades of orange and gold, Katie touched the framed unit patch that once hid inside her jacket lining and remembered what her old commander used to say, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." She'd kept hers burning for 15 years in the dark. Now she could finally let others see the light. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever hidden your real strength because the world told you to be smaller, please like and subscribe. Katie's story is a reminder that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. Comment below, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? I want to hear your stories.